All right, well, welcome everyone to the fourth edition of our patio conversations. Hopefully, by now, we're getting into a little bit of a rhythm with this second Thursday of the month being blocked out, and hopefully, the audience will increase as well. So, over the last few months, we've been trying to open up different themes which the patio is trying to engage with, and of course, you can access all the themes on our website, which is patio.network. Today we've got a couple of really interesting presentations, but we're also introducing a new theme. So I want to talk about the theme first. So our director for the theme is Gauri Bharat, who's a professor at CEPT University, and I think we'll hear a little bit more later from Gauri, who is also acting as a respondent today. Unfortunately, we had Aparajit Ramnath, who was supposed to act as a respondent, but he is ill and can't make it. So Gauri we'll hear a lot more from Gauri later. But the theme that we're introducing today is what we call material and construction histories. Of course, construction histories is an area that has been developing quite a bit, and a lot of us are directly involved with the different international organizations around it. And I'm currently sitting in Belgium, and we've got lots of colleagues here, which I've invited to the session today. So hopefully they will be joining in as well, looking at how we are imagining the impact of construction history as a methodology in trying to understand challenges of the history of architecture and construction in the global south, but particularly in the Indian Ocean Rim area. But I do want to highlight the material component on it, which is quite important, of course, to work a lot of us who are involved with PATIO and is an integral part of what PATIO is trying to do. So the theme generally sort of shifts the emphasis in the conceptualization of architectural history from the object or the artifact, which we usually tend to focus on, to the underlying processes. And this kind of narrative we expect could start, as we've seen in other cases, by looking at building sites or tools of construction. But in this case, we are also looking at the material itself. So there's a geospatial movement of specific materials, like mud or cement or steel or concrete, as we'll hear about today, or even a study of the building components that come out of that. So the specific kinds of building blocks or tiles and how they sort of move around and the impact that they have on construction cultures. So we're moving away from a sort of technological focus on the materials to explore this underpopulated sort of field of material construction history in terms of how materials and buildings are shaped by the social, cultural, and economic dynamics within a particular region or the site of their deployment. And particularly in the context of PATIO, we're also looking at exchanges that might happen across the Indian Ocean. So that's a quick overview of this, and hopefully we'll have many more of you and many more sessions which will help flush out this theme in the future. With that, we have two speakers today, so I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers. So first we have got Meenakshi. Meenakshi is a PhD candidate at the Department of History at Yale University, and her dissertation focuses on material, technological, and environmental histories of cement concrete in modern South Asia. She originally did her MPhil and MA in modern history from the Center for Historical Studies at JNU and completed her undergraduate degree at Ambedkar University in Delhi. So Meenakshi is going to talk to us a little bit on the basis of her PhD project, what she's been looking at. And as I'd said before, she's looking at extraction of cement concrete in the sort of early 20th century context. So with that, I will let Meenakshi take over. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present some of my work here. It's my first time at these patio conversations. I hope to be part of it going forward as well. So I'm going to share my screen, which we just tested out. Yeah. Oops. Can you see my screen?
I think it's loading for me.
Okay. Yeah, it should be working now. Wait.
Yeah.
All right, so I titled my presentation Mineral Landscapes of Concrete in South Asia. And so I thought that I would begin by giving a little bit of context about where this part of my work fits into my larger project, which is my PhD dissertation. And my dissertation looks at different themes, all all on cement concrete, and I hyphenated in this way because I'm specifically talking about Portland cement concrete. But there's other aspects of my work which stretches into the 19th century as well. And some of the things that I'm interested in include questions of standardization, industrial technology, changing labor practices, also the changing nature of structures and infrastructures and public works and so on. So everything really. But this part of my work, which I'm hoping is an early chapter in my dissertation, looks at the limestone and limeshell mining regimes that had existed long before industrial cement, but then becomes a more expansive endeavor in the 20th century. So at the very broadest level, my dissertation asks what were the infrastructures and environments that made concrete possible, and what kinds of infrastructures and environments did concrete make possible. So essentially, in the former, I'm talking about limestone mines, labor regimes, institutional frameworks, and so on. And the latter is more to do with the built structures and infrastructures. So I'm also thinking about finding ways to bring both of these together into the same argument within my dissertation, right? And another thing that I wanted to highlight before I go into the flesh of my presentation is I use the word environmental infrastructures in my abstract. If you had read it, and the reason why I use this phrase is because in working through frameworks that I wanted to think about cement concrete pits, I found some useful literature from anthropology on infrastructures. And recently South Asian historians themselves are concerned more with using infrastructure as a sort of heuristic device to think about existing works on public works and materialities of governance and so on, but also as a pathway to think about newer kinds of histories of infrastructures. But I felt that in almost all of these extremely illuminating and valid projects, the history or the anthropology starts after the aggregation of concrete. So I think something that I wanted to complicate a little bit is the sort of idea that concrete infrastructures are this artificial thing that are used to fix nature or are sort of planted on existing natural environments to fix them or even as part of technocratic solutions for social engineering problems and so on, but rather to think of how environmental itself becomes an infrastructure for concrete, right? So I use this word or the phrase, and I borrow it from Emmanuel Crikey, who writes about environmental infrastructures and the process of infrastructuring environments and thinking of it as a verb. And I don't know how far I'm going to stick with this phrase, but at this stage of my project, I'm using this to think also about the environmental infrastructures of concrete, cement concrete. So some of the images that I'll show now, I clicked these last month at a limestone mine in the Ariyalur region in Tamil Nadu, right? And you don't really see any concrete here, except perhaps for in the left far out, you can see a cement factory, sort of the furnaces of them. This is yet another image of a cement factory. I clicked nearby next to a limestone mine. You see cattle grazing and so on, and the factory in the distance. And even this limestone mine from the same region. And to put it very quickly, my question is, how are all of these also concrete landscapes and not just urban environments or urban structures, right? So with that, let me jump into sort of specific history that I'm looking at and talking about. So, you know, in the 19th century, and I'm sure all of you will know that limestone is not has been used as a building material for many centuries before it became a fluxing agent in the iron industry and before it was a calcining agent in the cement industry. And some of the earliest work with limestone and lime, different kinds of lime, were done by colonial engineers, civil and military engineers, like the Royal Engineers. And if you look at the construction of, let's say, Fort William in Calcutta or even canals in Punjab, often the engineers were left to make their own building materials, make their own lime, and sometimes they would later become lime suppliers themselves. And so there's that kind of a history there. And the particular use of limestone and the experimentations that were done with these limestones by engineers were shaped by the nature of the engineering profession. So you have to always balance, I mean, even today, that's how I guess it is. You have to balance climate and cost and material and proximity and so all these different things. And an interesting example of the engineer on the ground, looking for materials and trying to sort of go with whatever they have can be found in the Roorkee Treatise, which is an extremely interesting text that most of you may be aware of. And if you one of the sort of advice that the text gives is that the engineers on the ground, in the colonial engineers in the 19th century in South Asia on the ground, have very little chemical knowledge of limestone and how to identify them. So they're advised to rely on their five senses as if there's no previous knowledge of these materials in the region. But so if you look at the first quote at the top, this is one of the instructions that's given to the engineers to identify limestone based on by tasting it and by smelling it and so on. So there's that kind of extreme closeness to the material that's present in this phase or in this period vis-a-vis colonial engineering works. And in the 1870s is actually when the material becomes undergoes a transformation in terms of its mining, when the iron and steel industry becomes more important. So you're trying to, the engineers and the industrialists are trying to triangulate the triangulate fuel, flux, and ore. So often the limestone deposits are found next to coal fields, and so that's where the iron and steel industries sort of the spatial pattern of the industry becomes established in relation to the existence of limestone as well as coal in that way. So this is the sort of two themes in the 19th century history of limestone that one finds. Digging a little bit deeper into this history, you see that the landscape or the geology of limestone is so diverse in the subcontinent. Some of the famous engineers, you look at Cotley, the Ganges Canal project uses Kankar, I think. You come down further to the south, Arthur Cotton and several other colonial engineers work with magnesian limestone, which I think it's dolomite. We call it dolomite perhaps now. The Godavari engineering projects of Arthur Cotton were done with this magnesian limestone. So there's all sorts of varieties of limestone being used at this time. And well into the late 19th century. And as the engineering profession becomes more institutionalized, there's a cement experiments division that is set up, which tries to prospect for new kinds of limestone and more finer Kankar and so on. And there's a particular engineer who actually started considering limestone quite corruptive and was exploring the hills of Rohtas in Bihar, which is now a major center of cement production for new limestones and so on. So in sum, the 19th century is characterized by continuous prospecting, experimentation, and local and very contingent uses of materials that are locally available. And well, Portland cement gets, I think the imported Portland cement is used from the late 19th century, but even so, all these materials continue to be used. So coming quickly to the 20th century, of course, it goes without saying that the industrial manufacture of Portland cement shapes the extent of the use of limestone mines. And several private and private capitalists as well as princely states tried to show that their territories or their lands have the highest quality limestone as an attraction for capitalists to come and invest in their princely states. And this is the case for Mysore. This is the case for also Gwalior, and I think the Tatas become very invested in the Gwalior region and start setting up some cement works there as well. The first cement factory, the cement works in the South Asian subcontinent, had actually been started much earlier in I think the late 19th century and early 20th century, but the first major and successful one was started in 1914. So this is the sort of interwar industrialization story that's happening, and limestone gets inducted into that. And of course, in the very quickly going through this very large story, in the 50s, post-independence, and with the 5-year plans, of course, the scale of extraction increases. And I think the cement, there's this different institutionalized ways of similar to the 19th century engineering that occurs in terms of prospecting and using good quality or finding good quality limestone suitable for cement. I think something that I wanted to quickly touch upon before moving on to the shells is the new kinds of environmentalist concerns that emerge in the 70s and 80s, which actually only interestingly happened only in those regions of the Himalayas where limestone mining was more visible. So the hills, there's no greenery anymore. There's no, the hills are looking quite corroded, as opposed to subterranean mining that happened more in other parts of the subcontinent. And so there's this new visual or an aesthetic and environmental concern about limestone mining that happens, which is accompanied by an immense optimism on the part of both the state and the industrialists that we have deposits lasting for over 100 years. It's been 100 years now since such statements were made, I believe, but the optimism is still there. And as now, I think most mines are mining is done in the southern parts of the subcontinent, also in the northeast of the Indian state. Coming to the question of shells, and this is something that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to put in the presentation, but I decided to go for it because I think it acts as perhaps not a foil, but I think a necessary story that has to go along with limestone because it's a completely different scale. It's a completely different labor environment. You dive into the water to collect the shells that become, you ground it into lime shell and you make white cement with it. And the industrial concern that dealt with it was, I think, Travancore cements from the mid 20th century extensively or actually exclusively built with this kind of shells. And the reason why I wanted to use this both in my project and in the presentation is because partly because of this image that you see here, which actually captures the something fundamental that I'm interested in, which is the idea of taking from nature and making it into an industrialized product, but at the same time, the value that this product has as cement is that it is artificial, right? So it is not something that you just take and do, but the role of the industrialist in transforming this natural into the artificial is something that I thought was quite interesting in this image. And as I said, they now make white cement paints and so on. So they continuously, the industry continuously changed the kinds of product that they were offering. So when white cement wasn't working anymore, I think now they've gone into white cement paints, which are more marketable and so on. There's also a story of labor, which maybe I can go into later in the Q&A or something. I don't want to run over time. But to very quickly give a sort of comparison, the limestone mines are worked largely by men, particularly agricultural workers who do seasonal work in the mines. Nowadays, it's more mechanized, but in the 20th century, it's largely migrant labor and local seasonal labor, and it's largely men. In the lime shell industry, it's a particular caste of fishermen who do this largely in Kerala and some parts of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. The case studies that I personally look at are from the Vembanad Lake region. And the women and children are also part of this sort of labor regime of mining for lime shell. And though they only go until, I think, knee deep. And they kind of feel that with their feet rather than use the fishing. They don't go out into the sea or the backwaters where the lime shell is available but they stay closer to the shore. So, but it's still a different kind of economy altogether, and therefore different kinds of commodification of limeshell and limestone that ends up both in the cement industry and both in buildings. But if you trace it all the way back, it's a completely different mineral landscapes that one sees. I believe I'm almost out of time. So I'll stop here, and I would love to speak more about it. I can speak endlessly about it, but I hope that in this very, very broad picture that I've painted of the 19th and the 20th century, some kind of an argument has come up related to what I began with, which is, how can I make sense of spaces like this as also concrete landscape, or how to bring in this mineral landscape into concrete story. And I don't want it to be a sort of something separate that goes on in the background, and then you have an urban setting or a bridge or a road. How are these necessarily together? And I hope that that this is comes through as the first step towards that. And I'll stop here. And thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Meenakshi. That was, it's all in time as well. So hopefully we'll have a lot more time for discussions afterwards. And I think without wasting any more time, I will just want to go off to the second speaker, which is Richa Shah. So Richa Shah is a graduate from Pune University in 2020, and then she later pursued her master's in architectural history and research from CEPT University, where she graduated in 2024. Prior to her post-graduation, she had also worked with organizations that strongly emphasize research and editorial practices like Built of India, Rethinking the Future, etc. So she's got some background there in research, which she's now bringing to her current work, where she's a research and teaching assistant at the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai. So I think one of the areas of her research focus is looking at the history of the Public Works Department in the Bombay Presidency, mainly Bombay and Pune, and she's focusing on the evolution of road construction in 20th century, which we're going to hear about a lot more now in terms of how cement concrete is being engaged in that area. So with that, Richa, thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'll just start sharing my screen. I hope it's visible.
Yes,
Yes,
we
it
just
is.
need,
If you can just make it full screen. Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm presenting my research today on the techno-material history of the Old Bombay-Poona Road, which is the Old Mumbai-Pune highway as we know of today. So this research began as a part of the studio work conducted under the MArch program at CEPT University, and this is further being developed for a paper and still a work in progress. So, as a studio, we visited the PWD archives in Pune and found a lot of archival material regarding various departments that come under the PWD and mainly road construction. But what struck me there, which was also an entry point into this research, was a set of 10 photos that show the process of construction of the Bombay Pune Road. These were clicked within a span of 4 days from 20 to 24 July 1939, apparently when the work was going on. And the most intriguing part of these photographs was the title. So it says Bombay Pune Road and modernizing it. So the question that comes to my mind first is, how do you modernize a road? And looking at this further, the questions that the photos and the captions that give some of these clues of what modernization might have meant during that period. So we notice the use of cement concrete, a material associated with modernity in the 1930s. Next, we see the hierarchy in labor that is visible in these pictures, which show a range from workers to supervisors and inspection officers through their gestures, through their dressing styles, and the way they behave on site, etc. So, the ACC officer here is explicitly mentioned and signals the arrival of a new role in the PWD hierarchy, the corporate technical assistant. Yeah, ACC here stands for Associated Cement, Associated Concrete. I'm sorry. So the ACC
Cement
here
companies.
is a
Yeah.
Associated Cement Companies, yes. So this was a new role, the introduction of corporate into this field. And finally, we see the use of machinery, which is very prominently depicted here, like the miller's mixer or something that they call the road finishing machine in these pictures, which is actually a paver machine that we know of today. So, to understand this notion of modernization, we look at the time period of the 20th century. Now, here, the early 20th century saw a phase of intense experimentation with the upcoming technologies and materials, as well as the commercial promotion of cement concrete against the previously used materials for road making. This can be seen through the advertisements in the journals that urge people to start using this new material as it is low maintenance. And next, we move on to the late 20th century, which rather than experimentation in techno materiality, looks at the standardized procedures for constructing roads and highways in the newly independent India, which was governed by a different spirit of nationalism. This excerpt from PWD specifications of 1950 details out the standards of road making through the examples of construction and experiments that are highlighted here. So, further, the early 20th century also looks at the formation of various institutions that were associated with the developing nationalist ideology within the country. As cement gets produced locally from 1914 onwards in India, various associations also start developing with the purpose of promoting the use of cement concrete, not only for buildings but also for roads and bridges. At the same time, committees like the Indian Roads Congress were developed that become a technical body to lay down design standards for roads and highways, and which could be followed nationwide and also share the latest research developments in the field of road making. So the purpose of these associations was not only limited to promotion of these new materials and technologies, but also provide essential solutions that cater to the local issues as well. These committees use mediums like publications, directories, journals, advertisements, etc., to promote their agendas. For example, the picture shown here shows a hoarding in Bombay that calls the municipality progressive because the roads here are made in concrete. So, somewhere this also shows us the notion of modernity associated with the use of material like concrete. The early 20th century also saw an increase in the number of bullock carts as a major source of transport. On the other hand, the First World War and industrialization led to radical growth of cars on the street. The imports also increased. So, with these developments, the roads now had to cater to both the bullock carts, which had wooden or metal wheels, and the new cars that were in the market, which had air-filled rubber tires uh, for transportation. So these metal wheels somehow cause damage to the asphalt and tar roads. The shoeing of cattle that we see today was also not much popular there. So even if these tires were changed or modernized, as these advertisements say, the bullocks were not able to walk on such tar surfaces with ease. Hence, it became necessary to create a tougher surface for these bullock carts as well. And this need gave rise to what we call the dual purpose roads, which which is an excellent example of what David Egerton calls the Creole technology, a transformation based on technologies catering to the locally specific institutions. Now, the concept of dual purpose roads was not completely new. Its earliest example is can be seen in the repair works in the Grand Trunk Road in 1850s, but now Portland cement concrete and imported technology was incorporated in the process and experiments. And the Bombay-Poona Road in the late 1930s turned out to be a testing ground for techno-material experimentations for the roads. So, what are these dual purpose roads? Basically, these are created for segregating traffic, where the central portion is kept for fast moving traffic and the strips on both sides are kept for slow traffic. Similar is the concept of confalt, which is concrete and asphalt, that are seen in the Bombay Pune Road, where the central asphalt strip is kept for the motor cars and the side concrete strips are kept for bullock carts. So this is an excerpt from the Indian Roads Congress Journal of 1939, which talks about a meeting where the delegates of the Indian Roads Congress had gone to a site visit to the Bombay-Poona Road a few months after the photographs were taken. So the photographs that we saw in the first two slides, these are some months away from those. And it talks about the experiments that have happened till date, like the use of bituminous tar and water-bound macadam. This is the first time the term confalt is mentioned in the context of a dual purpose road with its detailed specification. This term has never been used before, and you don't even see these in the later issues as well. Now, coincidentally, the specifications were given for the same road sections that were mentioned in the photographs as well. The excerpt mentions that how one section was consolidated with hand tamping while the other was done with the help of a road finishing machine, that is the paver machines. This machine was provided by ACC. And as we read ahead in the report, the discussion shows that although the machine was promoted by ACC, not all engineers at the Indian Roads Congress were convinced that this machine was more efficient or economic as compared to the manual work. So, as I kept reading the report further, the debate and also the experiments carried somehow show the rational approach of engineers towards these highly promoted and commercialized materials and products, and not using them just because they are a new age or state of the art elements. From 1940s onwards, some of these experiments started taking a more solid form, and even the institutions looked at standardizing these experiments. Taking a long term planning approach, the 20-year road plans were made based on the experiments that were successful. These also looked at standard typologies of roads. And the excerpt here shows how these decisions taken in these committees became standards that are laid in the PWD Handbook of Specifications. So, in conclusion, this entire phase of experimentation to standardization was not just the use of new emerging materials or technology, but understanding the needs of the period. The Public Works Department, established in 1854, had a vision of standardizing the processes of work within the infrastructural domain. But as technology evolved, the codes and procedures of road making also kept changing. The study of the experimental site of the Old Bombay-Poona Road opened up various perspectives through which the process of road construction could be visualized. The chart on the right, a part of the budget report of the 1969, shows the works done on different sections of the Bombay-Poona Road from 1957 onwards. Even though it is incomplete without the color coding right now, it gives an idea of how the use of these materials like asphalt and concrete overlap and still used despite new emerging materials and technologies. So, through the study of materials, it became evident that even though cement concrete was so far the best material for road construction, it did not overpower the previously used materials like asphalt and macadam. These decisions were also based on the location and significance of the road. The study of machinery shows that the fuel based machines, be it motor transport or construction machines, were preferred anytime over the steam based machines, which were becoming difficult to use. And even though we talk about things being modern, the context of the site is also very important. The image here shows a non concrete village road still being made with simple machine tools in the 1970s. So, despite multiple narratives of modernization, the aspect of technomateriality in the road construction will always depend on the resources that are locally available. So, understanding this context would have surely been the road to modernization itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richa, for that absolute sort of wonderful close reading of the documents, and gives us so many insights into the establishment of new roles and associations and terminology. So I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss further. So I'm going to get on to the next part of the session, which is looking at a response to this. For those of you who came slightly later, I should clarify, we were originally going to have Aparajit Ramnath as our respondent for today, but unfortunately Aparajit has taken ill. So Gauri Bharat will be the respondent today, and I can't think of a better person to respond to the conversations that we've heard right now. So as I mentioned before, Gauri, of course, is deeply involved with PATIO and is leading this theme as well. But she's a professor at CEPT University and is a program chair for the Architectural History and Theory program at the Faculty of Architecture. Based on her own previous PhD research, it kind of looks at lived histories where she explores built environments of the past and how they were shaped and in turn shaped the individual and collective lives of people. But I think more importantly, today's discussion is a second area of focus, which focuses on histories of making. Gauri got, I think 2019, a Graham Foundation grant for a project called Modernization Before the Modernists, the rise of concrete in the early 20th century India, which perfectly aligns with the conversation we're having today as the project looks at looking at unusual archives of material catalogs, association yearbooks, technical journals, advertisements, etc., to understand this widespread network of professions familiar with the concrete. So I think we'll have lots of wonderful, interesting conversation based on that. So I'll invite Gauri to provide her first response. Gauri.
Thank you, Amit, and thank you all for, thank you, Meenakshi and Richa, for your lovely presentations. Lots of ideas. As Amit said, I'm currently working on a history of concrete, so lots to learn from as well. Meenakshi, a couple of things that really stood out for me. In my work, I'm not looking so much at the manufacture of cement, except to the extent that it influences, the availability of cement influences the use of concrete. But what you started with is such an important thread that especially as built environment professionals in South Asia, for a lot of people, the modern world pretty much begins with independence, and it kind of, the fact that there was such a long run up to the ways in which we built by the mid-20th century, there was such a long run up, and the fact that there are overlaps with indigenous techniques, materials. So what was really interesting was your very brief mapping, but I've downloaded your MPhil on the side and we'll be going through that as well. But I think the use of cementitious materials in the 19th century and that over decades, how that consolidates into the more formalized institutional mechanisms, industrial production systems of cement. It's a very interesting timeline, set of developments to track, particularly because, as you also hinted, there is that constant tension with the space of practice, which remains an incredibly almost chaotic, so every engineer is experimenting with what they can do. So, and that really shines through, as you said, when you look at limes, because limes are so varied and have these complicated recipes. And yet there is that desire to standardize. There is an intention to standardize, given the political economy of colonial rule, the difficulty of getting materials, wanting to control materials. And so by looking at the landscapes of cement production, you're really bringing out those background conditions which make things possible. And that was really interesting. Also because the need to control raw materials is linked to scarcities of production, scarcities of, there's the general context of scarcity. Portland cement was coming in via the sea, and it was just, super expensive, complicated. There was deterioration. So I think it's very interesting to map out where and how this is happening. And in that, what you're also bringing up is the incredibly complex material landscape of the subcontinent itself. What was, one thing which I was wondering if you can talk about it, since you're talking about the landscapes, and if I put it together with what Richa is saying, and in a sense, this refers to both of you, the sites that both of you all are engaging with are typically somewhat remote. So there is a link with the major metropolitan production centers, the sites that use. But in both your cases, you're talking about hinterlands, you're talking about landscapes that are not necessarily the focus of when we think of the modern world. And yet, if we look at where limestone is extracted from, so the experience of modernity for people who are in and around those sites, and for those who are involved in labor of extraction, it's a very, very different experience. It's really one of a disrupted landscape, of a denuded landscape, and of some development which is remote, abstract, and they are at one end of the spectrum, but not necessarily the beneficiaries of that development. Which, especially when you showed your photographs, it's really interesting because I also grew up in the sort of hinterland of, not the hinterland, but right in the peripheries of a company. And the company is this remote entity doing something which is clearly very important and yet quite cut off from your life. So, and with that, maybe I'll just share a couple of things with Richa, and then, you could comment on. Richa, again, very interesting. I mean, of course, I've seen your work earlier. What was really interesting was, the advertisements around the roads are one of the surprising things that you see constantly from the 1940s about, how that is the future of modern India in the 1940s, having roads. And as you were presenting, it did make me wonder again where we think as the sites, centers, and frontiers of modernity. I'm guessing roads are a very interesting site because irrespective of where you lived or where you worked, you traversed roads. And so the materiality of the road becomes part of your experience of being in a modern place. And what you really brought out again is the tensions between the modern as this new thing and yet having to constantly negotiate, work with, because the bullock cart is this absolutely phenomenal. The bullock carts get the concrete roads and everybody else has the asphalt, which is such a fascinating image of the city in the 1940s, of having to make special concessions for bullock carts. And so again, that question, I mean, what I saw in both your cases is that it's only when you look at materials and the question of materiality, where is it coming from, who is using it, and what impact does it have on the environment and the landscape, that we begin to see very different experiences of modernity, very different sites for sure, because both of you are talking about sites that are either hidden, in Meenakshi's case, we don't think of mines at all, or so ubiquitous that you don't pay any attention to them as entities in themselves. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, or any, any responses or any thoughts on this. Meenakshi, you want to?
Yes, sure. Yeah, thank you so much for your response and the comments. It's extremely helpful and also resonates with some of the things that I've been thinking of, particularly in relation to this question of the site of modernity, or this particularly the site of concrete, cement concrete in particular. Where is concrete? So yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about. And I think that, so I think because this is part of, in my case, part of a dissertation which traces different sites, hopefully, some part of it is also going to look at, we already have started looking at bridges, for instance, as well. And something that I've noticed, and I think it kind of speaks to what you were talking about, is this, the image economy of even the advertisements that Richa showed. So they all have, they say bridges against the background of like mountains, or there's rivers. There's always this kind of attempt to portray modernity with some kind of natural element in its surroundings. And I think that does describe, I think, in some senses, how at least advertisers and industrialists thought about the site and about concrete modernity. And something that I've come across quite often, again, is this attempt to talk about, I think, because you mentioned scarcity and sort of resource economy, this resource scarcity, and that the relationship between mines and construction and so on. When in the post-independence period, when there's scarcity of resources, what they do is not always expand the mines, though that is the overall trend. It's also to sort of go to those small pockets in these hinterlands, in these smaller sites where there may be small deposits of limestone. You set up a mini cement plant over there, and so then that entire area is transformed through that. So I think the trajectories and movement of industrialization or industrial modernity is something that I think in my work comes through if I look at limestone landscapes. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if any of this makes sense, but some of the thoughts that came up as you were speaking, as
I just add one point there, and then maybe Richa, you can respond. Since you mentioned the period of the the post-independence period, given the shortage of cement at that point in time, it's also quite interesting that a lot of architects go back to lime and experimentation in lime. We see a lot of that in Ahmedabad, for instance. And a lot of the buildings, places like NID, for instance, which are quite renowned, they've built 3 domes at NID, which many of you may be aware of. The first dome is entirely done in RCC. The second dome has an RCC ring and it's got a brick infill, and the third dome is an entire brick shell. And that really had to do with the fact that they only, there was a ration of like 20 bags of cement or something like that. So it's also interesting that the shortage of the material produces a particular kind of architectural response. I'm not aware of how it panned out in the rest of the country, but I think the rationalization of cement, and then in response to what you're saying, that it also has then an impact on the way extraction processes begin to get turned into smaller units. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Richa, you have...
So in my case, when I talk about the Bombay-Poona Road, so this road construction was mainly a part of this rhetoric of movement that the British government was looking at. So within this rhetoric, it was necessary to, connect all of these cities, the Bombay being the headquarters of the presidency, then Pune being the monsoon capital of the presidency, and also the second largest cantonment in the presidency itself. So that's why this connectivity was very much important. And hence this site, not exactly a remote site, but in process of becoming one of the most important roads for military movement, for trade movement, etc. So I think the experiments that are done on these road construction on the roads here was actually essential for their own agendas, the own agendas that the British had of trade and military movement, etc. So somewhere these experiments, and when you talked about the bullock carts, so from 1850s onwards, the bullock carts also were, as they have called it, modernizing. So there were a lot of these different evolutions that happened to the bullock carts as well. And then the coming of cars, the imports of cars that was happening. So all of this together makes up why this was an important road during that time as well.
Yeah, I think discussions around infrastructure have focused on big infrastructure very often, transformations in shipping, the railways. And when you're talking about the materiality of the road network, and, there seem to be all these sort of micro inventions, for want of a better word, like corn fault and things like that. So obviously it was a site of terrific investment on the part of the people who are involved in these projects. And I think what you're beginning to open up is a sort of social material life of road infrastructure, for want of a better word. And again, that kind of stuff has been done around things like sanitation, but we don't think of roads as necessary. It's just it's a flat surface that we go on. But what you're bringing out is that there's more to it, which is really quite fascinating. Saptarshi has a point. Maybe I read it out. Saptarshi, do you want to come in?
You're on mute still, Saptarshi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Now we can.
Okay, thank you both for fascinating presentations. Meenakshi, unfortunately, I missed the beginning of yours, but I could still grasp what was going on. What I've written down, and because I've recorded this question so that you can take it away, and I want more of a reflection rather than an answer. I think that what both your studies do is they radically reimagine space in the experience of modernity. In Meenakshi's case, the mind and the movement of material so when we think about material histories, where usually our scalar imagination is very much, it's limited and it's microscopic almost at certain levels in the techno-scientific way. But what you are saying is, no, there is this larger sort of way in which we understand material, which is its geography and its circuit. And Richa, I love the wordplay on road to modernization. And what struck me about that was that you are effectively saying that, okay, the sites of modernizations are not these centers like Bombay or Pune, which is the summer capital, but actually the hinterland connecting the two, which is again a very different site at which modernization happens. It's not within the city, but it is actually in the sort of interior that connects the cities and places where there is almost like this introduction of an object which is not supposed to be there in the first place. So I was just wondering how you'd like to, maybe if you have any thoughts on explicitly foregrounding this as your work develops. So I'm not looking for a very definite or resolved answer, but if you had any thoughts on this point.
Perhaps I can just quickly respond to that. Again, I don't think it's an answer, but thank you so much for this comment and this thought, and I really appreciate it, because something that I am doing, though I don't know how it will pan out, is to make some maps of how industrial pattern, or let's say industrial location patterns, have shifted over the course of the 20th century, particularly cement industry, of course. And how that is that, and then overlaying that with some with the map of the limestone deposits and so on. And I think I'm hoping, again, not to sort of have preconceived arguments before I have my maps, but something that I'm hoping is to sort of see that see that how this shift has happened from western and central, and also an eastern pocket towards the southern part of the subcontinent over the course of the 20th century, and also how then that may reflect different channels of capital, so sort of ACC Bombay-based capital versus Southeast Asian, sort of it's the Chettiars, the Chettinad Cement Company, and then there's the Ramco companies, which have a different kind of capital coming from a Southeast Asian migrant network. So hopefully when I visualize it as a map and I see this transformation, maybe there's something that an argument, the spatial argument that comes across about capital and about cement, but nothing yet. But thank you so much again for that comment.
Gauri, can I briefly respond to Meenakshi before Richa comes in? Yeah, thanks. So Meenakshi, what you've touched upon is something extremely important in how we historians work also, because one of the modes of expression we have is writing. And when you think of the map And writing forces us to narrate history in a linear way. But that's why I'd be curious when you said that there is the Chettiar sort of way center or whatever the location of producing and distributing cement, and there's the ACC, which is the Western and Peninsula and so forth. That, are these happening simultaneously? So it's often that simultaneity which gets missed out. And I try to address this in my own research. I've done it with partial success so far, but it's also something that we're developing at this moment, that how do we describe the simultaneity of historical phenomena. So that might be very useful to push. And thank you for your response. Richa, did you want to come in?
Yeah. So as you said that not just these two centers like Bombay and Pune, but the connectivity was very important. So I think regarding that itself, so this experiment of Confalt that I have mentioned in my presentation is one of those experiments. There have been a lot of those. For example, there was this experiment called Creteways or Trackways, which again used this new material concrete in very different ways. So there are a lot of such other experiments as well, which is kind of which I will be looking at further. And also this idea of the use of machinery, because as evidence says, we have this photograph that talks about how this road making machine was an important invention during that time, and they have pictures to show that how it was so important. So I think that is another part which I'll be focusing on, that how these machines were making their own places within this construction history. Because as I previously mentioned, India and mainly such roadworks and all of these were basically a site for experimentation. So that is something that I will be looking further uh, on how this idea of modernization is changing with these different smaller elements, but when they come up together, they make up this whole narrative. So
Thank you, Richa. Yeah, I was curious as you were talking as to how do the machines reach the spot before there is a road? So do they have caterpillar tracks, or, because there's no road, but these enormous machinery and its paraphernalia is also reaching nowhere where a road needs to be made? Or does it follow the making of the road and sort of, the way metro tunneling is done, that you build and dig and sort of then reach where the current work is going on. But anyway, thank you for sharing how you're thinking about this going forward.
So just to comment on this part, so it wasn't the case that there were no roads. There were a very raw form of roads, the earth roads and everything. But then this is where the whole rhetoric of betterment comes into picture. That they actually wanted these roads to become more sturdy, more usable for their own purpose of trade or military, etc.
Thanks, Richard.
I think Lanka had his hand up. Did he want to speak, Lanka? Yeah.
Hello. Just to sort of build on Saptarishi's point, I mean, this sort of polarization, this sort of duality of, creating modernity through, what is essentially rural is actually also replicated, over the world. So, like, for example, Utsa Patnaik has a very famous and like very widely cited book chapter called The Free Lunch. And the basic argument is that that Brit that the British actually needed Indian resources and resources from elsewhere to start their industrial revolution. So it's pretty much the same sort of uh, transfer that's happening from the rural to the urban. So one is the metropole and the other is, the periphery, and the same sort of transfer happens. So you do need to extract, something from a rural landscape in order to enable urbanization or modernization or so on to happen.
So I think Sarah, did you have something to say?
Yeah,
And everybody, sorry, I'll just sort of say to everybody else, you can either write your comments in the chat or the Q&A, or just simply use the raise hand feature, so then we'll just ask you to speak. I think it's just straightforward like that. Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, Meenakshi, I think this is very fascinating work. And I just put one book in the chat, which if you don't already know, it might be useful for you. I just wondered if you're also going to go into the technicalities of cement production, because especially, there are different types of cement plants and they require different source materials, right? So if you're going to look to a geographical or a map analysis, their location might also have to do with the type of plant, the type of output they generate, etc. So I think there's another layer of beyond the geographically available materials, but also the technical processes happening in the plants themselves. And also, I don't know if you know the Belgian scholar Robbie Fivet, but he's also working on a similar topic and looking at the Belgian Congo. And interestingly, his findings are that certain cement plants there actually exceeded the kind of cement that came out of it, exceeded the expectations, or even the metropolitan Portland cement. So we always tend to think of cement as a standard product, but even the output of these factories varies greatly in terms of the processes and the source materials. So I think that can add also another perspective to your geographical analysis. Then I was also wondering, when we spoke about scarcity of cement and the way that inhibited its large application in certain places, I think there's also a labor aspect there, because if I look at, interestingly, my work in Pune in the 1930s, if you look at bridge construction, the tenders tend to specify cement mortars, but then you see that during the process it becomes lime mortar, because I think one of the elements is also that the labor is more familiar with the lime mortar, and it's often, like in the case of stone masonry bridges, for instance, you can see tendencies to replace it with cement block arches made of cement blocks, which was prescribed like that in the specifications. But then when you see the actual result, is that they still use the basalt stone, for which they had labor available to kind of make it. So I think not only a question of the material being available, but also the labor. And I think in Richa's case, these are actually very peculiar instances where the PWD is making available a certain budget and the ACC is importing expensive machinery, etc. But we have to be very careful with generalizing these things. And until the 1970s, lime mortar was still prepared with a bullock ghani in Pune. So these, overlappings or the non-simultaneity of different technologies is actually the fascinating part of it.
If I could quickly respond to that. Yeah, thank you so much for all really great comments that I can talk endlessly on about. But very quickly, just start with the labor thing. That's very fascinating, and I often find I have found in the archives, particularly engineers writing about labor, which is, taking it with as it is. They talk about the difficulties of beginning to build with cement concrete in Burma and South Asia, because the labor skills or the laborers they hired are more used to working with lime, and they often use or deal with concrete in the same way as they would with lime, and therefore engineers are so concerned that they're losing great batches of mixed concrete to the ramming and so on. So that's kind of it's a complaint, but I think to me it shows a sort of continuing embodied practices and so on. And on this other question of the technical aspects, yes. So the second chapter is of my dissertation. It's at standardization, and again, as not something that was probably successfully achieved, but as a norm, and whether to what extent that shaped industries and so on. And one of the sites where I think that came up to me were the cement kilns, right? And the different kinds of burning processes and so on, and different scales at which this happened. And so, yeah, as you said, the nature of the cement produced and the nature of the machinery within the factory, and all the other things that are out of control when it comes to the chemical process. I think all of this is definitely part of my work. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple of things to sort of add, particularly in the conversation that we've been talking about. There's been a lot of repetition around this idea of the rhetoric that is being produced around this and the implication of the PWD or the government being an actor. So there's, of course, other actors, and I think opening up that black box of ACC is quite important. I think ACC is not a single player. It's some of the most influential people in India around that. It's, I think, 11 companies. You've got Sarabhai, you've got Tata, you've got Dean Shaw, these are the people on the board. So I think, speaking of ACC just as a sort of one-party entity, I think misrepresents in terms of balance of what the agency of these people are. So I think that would be quite interesting to unpack. And also companies, for instance. So I'm aware, like, of course, around the same time, you have like companies like Gannon Dunkerley, which are sort of emerging and are doing a lot of work in infrastructure development. Again, early 20th century isn't really the sort of focus of my work with that, but I am aware of Gannon Dunkerley's sort of rise when airports started being built, and the implication of the technologies of being able to build runways and the use of cement, particularly, and the technologies that are required for that. So companies then also become a player in pushing certain rhetorics, and especially you've got people like Tata or Sarabhai or whatever who are sitting as part of ACC. So I just want to find out, is that something that you guys are planning to open up? It maybe also in terms of the kind of archival material that we're looking at, or how could we address the agency of these other stakeholders?
In my case here, as I said, like the ACC was one such association that looked into this, but then somewhere the question of these privately owned companies and the role of government also comes into picture. So one example that I would like to share was when I was reading about the history of this steamrollers for or road construction. So it was said that the British government had a role to play in bringing those who first experiment on a road in Kolkata, and later it was brought to Bombay and all of these other cities. So here the role of government is very well established. So something that I would also like to explore further is how these companies like ACC had a role to play, because even in the Indian Roads Congress Journal, it was very specifically mentioned that this specific machine was provided, the road making machine, it was provided by ACC. So I have not yet found a lot of material on how much involvement did these companies like ACC have in the road construction. But yeah, that is something that I am looking forward to.
Yeah, I think I've found that quite challenging as well, because unlike individuals, companies tend to hold on to their records and they guard it much more closely. So it's very hard to get access to the archival material. And in Gannon Dunkerley's case, and the unfortunate thing was, and I don't know how much of that is true, but they said that, of course, as it happens with a lot of archives in India, it got destroyed in one big monsoon rain at some point. Maybe it did, maybe there's something else there. But yeah, I understand. But There are company histories that do exist. So there are, people who talk about company history. So I don't know how much of that can provide insight into, this. Sorry, Meenakshi, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes. Yeah, the question of ACC as this monolith versus. So of course, even though they probably stopped being the biggest, as far as cement manufacturing is concerned, group around the mid 20th century, right? So I feel that in my work, although a lot of archive is available under the umbrella of the ACC, I think the Concrete Association of India and Cement Marketing Company and those kinds of institutions, I think, although very closely associated with the ACC, would perhaps be, I mean, their publications are something that I've been working with more. The Pune archive of the Tatas, they were quite reluctant to give me records on the after recent events. So I think the ACC is something I'll have to deal with. But I just wanted to also mention that a couple of things. Firstly, is that more than the ACC, I think the cement marketing company, if you look at its activities, I think it will really show the tensions within the different companies that come together to become ACC, because the idea is to sort of keep competition away and so on, right? So I think if I follow that track, or if we follow that track, there may be more insights into the internal tensions between, let's say, Porbandar or some other different cement companies. And that leads me to the second thing that I wanted to talk about, is that in terms of the players or the actors, there's of course the Indian capital through foreign management companies that emerge in the ACC and so on. But there's also, as I mentioned when I was speaking in the presentation, the princely states. Again, the root of capital there is very different, and it's also the state and also a business interest. So Travancore, I think I mentioned, Gwalior, Mysore. I think there were a lot of these princely states that were had their own idea of modernization, right? For instance, Mysore is a good example, and cement manufacturing becomes part of their modernizing project, I guess. So they're not, they're sort of not really a middle ground, but they're neither business interests but nor the British colonial state. So I think that would be another interesting set of players, and maybe different archives can come up there too.
Yeah, thank you, Meenakshi. That's wonderful. Before I go on to Lanka, I just wanted to check with Gauri, because I think you might be going through similar in your own work, struggling with the archives thing. So is there some insight you've got about archive that they should be looking at, or that you might want to share?
I know only horror stories, not too many insights, honestly. But just since you mentioned, I tried getting some volumes of some early volumes of the Concrete Association, the Indian Concrete Journal, and ACC has a lot of them scanned. And I wrote to them, and they said, "Yeah, we've got it." They sent me the first 4. I was looking for advertisements, and they didn't scan the advertisements because they thought it wasn't important. So they scanned all their feature reports, but out of the how many ever pages, about 30% of the pages were missing, because the company thought it wasn't important. And I think, as with looking for archival stuff in the global south, you're looking at, these are the times when you want to find places that time has forgotten. So I've gone into old architecture schools, and their library has a cupboard in one corner that they haven't touched for 20 years. And you're like, yes. And there suddenly in that, you find. So I think you have to really just hunt. But the ACC has been fascinating. And yeah, I think it's just, especially early 20th century is so much of a hit and miss. The late 19th century is so well documented because of the Roorkee papers and things. By the time we get to the early 20th century, it's been quite crazy. And it's also interesting because what you mentioned, Amit, when I started my project on concrete, I was reaching out. There were some people who were still around who had practices in the 1960s. And routinely, all the architects are like, nah, we chucked everything. They have a bunch of drawings if you're lucky, but nothing else. And so you're really just, looking through stuff that people have forgotten. So yeah, that's the only.
Yeah, access is a problem, but of course, like you said, cherry picking and keeping certain things and leaving other things out has other problems in the way archives are sort of preserved. All right, I'll go to Lanka and then Pedro after that.
Yeah, there's just a few sort of thoughts on the whole ACC question. There is already a company history on the ACC. It's called, for people who, yeah, so it's called ACC, a corporate saga or something, but I haven't seen the book anywhere, so I don't think it's widely available. Um, if you already haven't done it, there's a lot of material available on ProQuest, especially TOI. I've been able to find a lot of ads put out by the Concrete Association of India. So that's a good repository for the kinds of ads that they used to put out, and also their predecessors. The sort of foreign countries that the foreign companies that were trying to sort of make inways into India and so on. So both are very fascinating.
Sorry, which was the second one? So you had ProQuest and?
Yeah, so ProQuest has a Times of India digital, digitalize the Times of India. And yeah, the third thing I was going to say is I got lucky. Like I was in the Bombay, the Maharashtra State Archives, which are in Bombay for 4 months, and I actually found that. So basically, if someone gets a government contract, there's a good chance. If, for example, the entity that you are studying has executed a government contract, there's a good chance that the documents will be actually available in the archives. So because they sort of used to get the documents there and file it. So I've been actually able to find lots of interesting stuff from the cement company that existed in the 1920s. Like actual documents about the cost of production, it's a very detailed breakdown. So you can try doing that. And lastly, I don't think we should underestimate the role of the ACC as a monolith, because that was really the point. That was the point. It was it wanted to set up a monopoly and control the price. But it's what happens in a bit later around independence is that the government actually introduces controls on distribution and price. So that severely sort of twists the, it restricts the kind of monopoly that you can have. And one of the tentative, because I'll also be studying cement, but from a very, political economic perspective and, that sort of point. So one of the tentative conclusions that I've been able to come to is, between the building sector and the cement producing sector, there is actually a close alliance in the early part, in the mid sort of, in the middle part of the 20th century. But when you sort of keep going further and further, they actually start sort of fighting against each other, and so much so that I think about 15 to 20 years ago, you basically had the building industry filing a case against the concrete and the cement manufacturers and saying that they were cartelizing, and they were becoming a cartel or whatever. So these kinds of conflicts, inter-industrial conflicts, are also very important to trace.
You're muted, Amit.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Lanka. I said I will just move to Pedro now. He's had his hand up. Hi, Pedro.
Hello. Look, I've got a question for Meenakshi. It's about the shell cement, the white cement. which to me is really interesting in that it is at a completely different scale of industry. It's to some extent something that grows out of something that artisanal, and it maybe has a wider dimension. But to me, the really interesting thing about the shell cement is that it's actually possibly a much older version and relates to other things in Asia, which is the production of chunam, not only for kind of mixing with betel nuts and things like that, so it's got a drug component, but it's also something that gave rise to very, very complex recipes for various types of waterproofing and other aspects. So I was surprised to see it as something that was part of a spectrum that involved very, very large scale of production of cementitious materials. And it'd be interesting to find out what your attitude to that might be. End of story.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I didn't want to spend too much time on that out of fear of running out of time. But the question of lime shell, you're right, the chunam question. There's certain treatises from even way before, but also the 1830s, for instance. Paisley, who was a royal engineer who wrote on limes and calcareous materials, writes about chunam, particularly in Madras, as often mixed with eggshells, I think, to give and that apparently gave a particular sheen to buildings in Madras that weren't present elsewhere. And of course, the story that I talked of limestone is also from that sort of. This is, of course, on the western, the coral coast, but the story that I was talking about was more from the eastern coast of southern India. But even so, I think there's an extremely interesting history there. In fact, the first cement manufacturing company in India was set up, I mean, not Portland cement, but just cement was in 1904 in Madras, which used shells, but there wasn't enough of a market for it, so it closed soon thereafter. So that is sort of a beginning and then a quick end. And then there's also the attempt to take these shells from the coast of the Madras coast and to take it to Calcutta to sort of replicate this really smooth sheen on the buildings there. But apparently the water that they mixed with in Calcutta had too much saltpeter in it, and it didn't have the same effect and the sheen. So again, to me, that spoke of a very particular local use that they tried to replicate, but couldn't match the beauty, and so on. So there's a lot of such stories about chunam and from limeshell. And coming to this eastern coast that I spoke more about, which is the Vembanad Lake, which is a prehistoric sort of estuary, I think, and they have a lot of these shells that almost fossilized, which also become chunam, right? And I was recently speaking to some old people of the older generation from that area, and they also used this chunam to plaster their walls. But something interesting which happens there is that soon they start using cement, big Portland OPC concrete, because all of the lime shell is being rerouted to the cement industry for the white cement. So there's no longer a local use to the same scale as there was in earlier times. So there's all these snippets that I've been able to that I've come across. As you began your question with, I think the difficult thing is to reconcile the scale of this kind of an operation with the sort of big story of limeshell and cement industry and so on. But that is something that I continue to think about. I don't know if this answers your question, but some thoughts that I've been having.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this is also something that traveled across the Indian Ocean, since we're in a patio session. I mean, this lime shell burning is.
Well, I believe Pedro had a wonderful paper a few years ago at the Construction History Conference looking at Chunum and the Portuguese routes of transfer. Anyway, I am mindful that we are very close to our 90 minutes, which doesn't mean that we can't go over, but we are trying to keep this reasonable for everybody. There is one topic that has come up, so we'll try to address that at least, which just kind of deals with this is a question by Ishita, which kind of looks at challenges of methodology, method, and the researchers. And I think here the question is of the role of language in dealing with these sort of regional histories. So, of course, there's certain absences of archives and discovery of archives, and in English language, there's still access to some stuff, but what happens with local regional languages? So, yeah, so Ishita is asking if there is something you can share about the challenge or the role that language plays in deciphering these histories. Richa, did you have to go through did you get through any archival material which was in local language as well, which you had to interpret, or?
So not very specific to road construction, but yeah, in the context of Pune, Marathi as a language played a very important role. And I think this is how so just trying to connect it to the photographs that I had of the road construction. The thing where I talked about the hierarchy through, dresses or body languages and all of that. So somewhere we kind of see on a position of an officer or a supervisor, we have these British government officers, and then we have other supervisors or overseers that look at all of these works, and they are mostly from a background of an Indian education, which are very fluent in both of these languages, the local languages, as well as how these officers played a role in all of these government works and using languages like English and all. So I think this specific hierarchy and the position of overseers or supervisors was somewhere important in also deciphering these languages, so that the laborers who are not aware of such experiments, so I think these overseers played a role here.
Yeah, we could see that in the archive also, right? That the letters or correspondence, the notes that we have from overseers are usually written in the Devanagari script. But I think it also has to do with what we don't write about, right? More than the questions of translation. I think there's a lot of material in vernacular languages that we just tend to not look at, and that's really a major issue.
I think the question of language for me also, there was a point that I had written when both of you were speaking around the discourse that you're looking at. Or clearly, in Rich's case, where we're talking about the rhetoric and the billboards and advertisements, you are talking about a much more sort of public discourse, and you are trying to engage with a completely different audience. While in Meenakshi's case, it was very much a professional sort of discourse where they're engineers trying to figure out the technical aspects of it, but also trying to figure out how or better quality of things can be produced. So that's quite interesting as well. So there is the language of the discourse, and then the language that the researcher is trying to engage with. So I think that's so in Meenakshi, in your case, have you sort of only been looking at the professional discourse, or do you find that this kind of other influences of other languages or discourses sort of come in between?
Yeah, if I can just answer that. For sure, I have been, so one is the language of the engineers, and their the way that they describe, and they sort of, and their language is part of their professionalization and the journals and so on. But I'm also looking at, so in my case, the languages that I know that I work with are Tamil and Malayalam. So one instance where I probably already have encountered this question of language is in advertisements, and not necessarily in newspapers, but more recently in the TV advertisements and so on. I think the the affect of the advertisements. If you look at in English, it's quite different from, let's say, a Malayalam advertisement for cement from the 90s or something. There's always these references to familial bonds and sort of property disputes. So it's a funny and complex story of advertisement for cement. So I think that kind of registers of, or let's say the culture that comes with the language reflects in the advertisements, if you look at it in a native language for sure, or in my native language, and I similarly in Tamil. But I haven't come across these, but I know that all of the organizations that we were talking about just a while ago have publications in Indian languages, so manuals, technical manuals, and also instructional manuals and so on, which I'm hoping I can get my hands on at some point. So I want to see how they may compare with a sort of English. So what's the lexicon, or what's the are these direct translations? Who's the audience? So I think all these questions might come up there as well. Yeah. Oh, and sorry, just I think another place. Sorry, that I wanted to mention is
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. In the discussions around projects in newspapers, so if you have like a project coming up, if you look at local language newspapers, the discussions and the public of the local language newspaper will be very different from, let's say, the Times of India or the engineering supplement of the Times of India. So that I think is also very interesting. So, if you're looking at a dam building in the 1930s, like the Metul Dam, the way it's depicted in the Times of India would be very different, let's say, in the Tamil Journal or a Tamil newspaper. So I think that is also a sort of third instance where language might paint different pictures. Yeah.
Just had a small point there, Amit, because another kind of language which I think largely remains unrecorded unless it turns up is the language that artisans, laborers use themselves, and the terms they have for I don't know, subtleties of material. And that has been very interesting. I mean, in a completely different context, we've been looking at words that carpenters use. And a lot of that is linked to where carpenters have historically migrated from, because Gujarat is not a place which naturally has wood, at least the regions around Ahmedabad. So language travels with artisans, laborers, and it makes its way. So once in a while, you'll find a 19th century report talking about a fauda or something like that with the anglicized kind of thing. So there is the language of people who are working, and that seems to be this really incredible mix, because labor circulates, and with them mix of terms that are used. It's a mix of where they've been, where they've worked, and it's almost got this own, obviously a very distinct lexicon. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a few comments in the chat as well about British officers being incentivized to learn native languages, and the documentation at the PWD Pune archives. So I think with every discussion we are learning that, of course, there's so much information that we are getting across in terms of the presentations, but also coming across these general methodological challenges of working in this particular area, but also within the context of the Global South, where we don't have access to archives sometimes, but also these challenges around languages and other forms of discourse and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that as we go forward, we'll be able to have a better position develop around these things. So again, if there aren't any other pressing questions, I would try to bring this to an end. Gauri, did you want to have a quick sum up sentence or something, and then we'll sort of close this session?
No, it's hard to sum up. There's just so many directions and lots of possibilities. So thank you very much for sharing really lots and lots of stuff that the conversation has sparked off. So from the dull material covering the Taj, we've now got like a fascinating more than 150 years of historical possibilities and inquiries. So yeah, thank you all very much.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, especially thank you Meenakshi, Richa, for your presentation, and Gauri for responding to that. And of course, this is a conversation, and every time we go over time, and I'm really in a way very happy about the fact that there's all this discussion happening. Please invite other people to join into the conversation. By now it's quite certain we are trying to keep this rhythm of the second Thursday of every month at this time, and so hopefully we'll have more and more people join in. The website is pretty straightforward. It's patio.network, and also you can join the newsletter so that you're aware when the next session is coming and what the topic is. So please stay in touch, and we will see you next month. All right, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.